Hi, I'm Charles Lister, Senior Fellow here at the Middle East Institute, and welcome to this webcast with my colleague Paul Salem. Paul is the Vice President for Policy and Research here at the Middle East Institute, where his work primarily focuses on issues of regional change in the Middle East and international relations of the region. Paul recently published an article in the Institute's journal focusing on issues that will be coming up for the next US president within the Middle East, and this will be the subject of our discussion today. So, Paul, to start off broadly, a lot of people talk about how unstable the Middle East is these days. There's the terrorist threat, there's the state of competition between Saudi Arabia and Iran, and various other underlying issues with regards to economic and governance failures. So what is your assessment of where the Middle East is today? What are the issues that this president currently faces on his way out, broadly speaking?
First of all, thanks, Charles, for guest hosting this webcast. And I do want to indicate and push our journal. This is the Middle East Journal. This article came out in this issue. This journal is 70 years old. So the oldest U.S. Journal on the Middle East. It's peer-reviewed, and you can get subscriptions online. The Middle East is obviously going through maybe a perfect storm of destabilizing conditions. Sometimes the way I look at it is I look first at a broken regional order, which has put Iran and the Gulf countries and Turkey in an open war with each other. So a broken regional order. Then I look at broken states. You have 4 failed states in the region: Libya, Syria, Yemen, and Iraq to a large degree. Alongside those broken states are brittle states like Lebanon, like Jordan, like Bahrain perhaps, or even Tunisia, which are surviving but at a very precarious level. You have the greatest rise of terrorist proto-states, not just terrorist groups. Obviously ISIS being the most visible one, but Al-Qaeda being resurgent as well, as you yourself, Charles, write prolifically about. And the fourth dynamic that I look at is the underlying stress factors. Very rapid demographic growth, a large youth bulge, very tight land resources, dwindling water resources, high unemployment, and the trend lines in these issues generally getting worse, not better, partly because of slow economic growth in general. That's true of global economic growth, but it's true of many of the economies of the region. And secondly, climate change has an increasingly, and will have an increasingly difficult impact on the region. So these are very difficult circumstances. And when you look at sort of where we are today in 2016, there are 2 moments that really led us to where we are here in terms of immediate conditions. One is the 2003 invasion of Iraq, which toppled this major state in the region. I would say it's like if some foreign army came and took out the government of Mexico or the state of, there would be problems. And we're still living with the after effects of the 2003 invasion, empowerment of Iran, marginalization or radicalization of a lot of Sunni groups, and a very unstable regional system. And the second earthquake really were the Arab uprisings of 2011. So that's kind of gives you a view of things. I'm not totally pessimistic in that sense, because I do think the uprisings of 2011 indicate sort of a positive empowerment of people, young people, women, and so on. But as with all revolutions and early empowerments, the first thing usually that happens is disorder, pushback from government, civil war sometimes. So in the long run, maybe I'm more optimistic than the short run.
Yeah, exactly, and that's probably where I was going to go next. I think you do paint a perfect storm picture, a pretty dire state of the Middle East, and I think an awful lot of the things that you listed seem to be underlying kind of societal dynamics or socio-political dynamics that take a long time to either develop positively or negatively. So whether you're looking at a bad trend or a good one, we're looking long term at a lot of the things that you listed, with the exception, of course, of the 2003 invasion of Iraq and the Arab Spring. But I wonder, when we're connecting the Middle East to the US, are there other things that the United States has or has not been involved in, pushing or not pushing enough, that have led the Middle East to where it is today, more related to those underlying drivers? So if we're looking at economics, if we're looking at the political systems, have there been policies in the past from previous US presidents and the ones still in place today that have either pushed some of those drivers in a worse direction or in a better direction?
Well, I think the U.S. impact on this is largely on international and regional conditions, which are very impactful,
Right.
and less so on the domestic dysfunctions. I think in terms of the Arab Spring and the explosions that we saw in 2011, those are dysfunctions in Arab societies and Arab states' relations to their own societies. Of course, the U.S. has a role. They had good relations with most of these governments, but I wouldn't say that they had any primary role in that. That is something that the Arab world is going through and not going through very well.
Right.
The U.S., as we saw in the what was called early on the Arab Spring and so on, the U.S. neither had much impact on the uprisings themselves, didn't even know that they were about to take place, nor had they much impact on how Egypt reacted, Syria reacted as governments, Yemen, and so on. So I would say on that fundamental level of state-society relations, the U.S. plays a very marginal role. But on the regional and international conditions, it plays a very major role. And the two signature moments or dynamics that the U.S. has a great impact on, one we mentioned was the invasion of Iraq and the regional disorder that we now find ourselves in. That is something the U.S. had a key hand in. The second dynamic is U.S. inaction for a long time on the Israeli-Arab conflict, or not really using its leverage on Israel in particular to stop the settlements and to allow conditions for a two-state solution. It's true that maybe today the Israeli-Palestinian, Israeli-Arab conflict is not grabbing the headlines. Maybe it's not the most pressing issue in many capitals of the region, but it is one of the deep underlying problems which ISIS feeds on, Iran feeds on, and many others. In a more positive vein, I think the U.S., if we're looking at the next administration, has a positive role to play in some of those issues. One is to try to encourage the countries of the region, rather than to be in conflict, but rather to find a way to accommodate each other. We can talk about that.
Sure.
More.
So it seems, if I can draw an inference from what you're saying, is that at times the US has either been guilty of inaction or simply reacting to events rather than necessarily implementing a policy with a long-term vision. And that's something that we can come on to. But I guess what my next question is we've looked at the Middle East, we've talked about a lot of the drivers and the insufficiencies going on that are driving a lot of the instability, but what are the United States' key interests in the region? I mean, when push comes to shove, the US has a lot of its own interests and concerns domestically, but when it comes to the Middle East, what are the key US interests going forward?
Yeah, I think when you look at it from the US government perspective, there are three interests. National security interests. These have been expressed by President Obama and many others. They're oil, weapons of mass destruction, and terrorism, currently. During the Cold War, there were other considerations, but that's over. The free flow of oil remains a national security interest for the U.S. because of its potential impact on the global economy and the U.S. economy. The non-proliferation or the reversal of the spread of the proliferation of weapons of mass destruction is a national security interest. President Obama put a lot of effort into the nuclear deal with Iran. He was somewhat active in Syria only when the issue of chemical weapons arose, and there was a deal with Russia over Syria's chemical weapons. Libya gave up its WMD program in 2003. Iraq doesn't have one. So that is a concern, and terrorism or the war on terror since 9/11 has been a primary concern. Of those three interests, number one and number two are in good shape. I mean, if you look at what Obama will leave to the next president, number one and number two are in good shape, and number three is in terrible shape. And that will shape the policy of the next president. So the next president, in terms of oil, they will not have a lot of concerns. The flow of oil from the Persian Gulf is sort of fine. Oil prices are low. On weapons of mass destruction, if the nuclear deal with Iran holds and continues to be monitored, that will be sort of fine. The only country with real WMD is Israel. The U.S. seems to be fine with that, unfortunately. On the issue of terrorism, or let's say the issue of terrorism will really be the driving factor for the next president vis-a-vis the Middle East. And when you look globally at what the next president will face, yes, there are concerns about Russia and there's long-term issues with China, but in terms of direct, real national security threat, a potential attack on New York or Washington or Chicago, it does come from the Middle East, not from Russia and not from China or Africa or anywhere else. So the Middle East will be a very high concern. On the war on terror, I think this administration is trying to leave the next administration or give the next administration some victories over ISIS. We have the campaign against ISIS in Mosul, and there's potential for maybe the war on Raqqa to happen before Obama leaves office. So there will be some progress, but the next president will still inherit a Middle East with major terrorist groups.
Sure. And so the way you sort of describe previous US policies, I think you made the point that there was kind of a Cold War set of policies or posture towards the region, and then the post-Cold War. But within individual presidencies, have there been different models of approaching the region? Have there been different focus, different areas of focus for different presidencies?
There's been variation, but I think we've gone through 4 phases. I mean, the Cold War was really offshore balancer, that the U.S. did not send troops into the region, but supported allies to counterbalance Soviet allies. When the Cold War ended in 1989-90, a year later, the U.S. sent a major army into the region to liberate Kuwait in the first Gulf War. And that led to a period between 1990 and 2000, which you might call not offshore balancer, but onshore policeman. Right. Containing Iran, containing Iraq, maintaining order. After 9/11, I think we went into a third phase, which I call a transformative hegemon. In other words, the U.S. felt that, A, it could be hegemonic, send the armies in like perhaps had happened in World War II in Japan and Western Europe, and be hegemonic and transformative, change the regimes of the region, push democracy in a U.S. sort of influenced way, and create a Middle East like Western Europe or Japan that was very sort of allied. And then President Obama came in, I think, trying to restore the offshore balancer role. The problem with that is an offshore balancer role implies that there's a balance to be maintained, whereas right now we have an open proxy war. Secondly, it implies you're dealing with states, not non-state actors and terrorist groups. So my recommendation for the next administration, at least in terms of how to think of it, is yes, I think the long-term objective is to get back to offshore balancing role. But in order to get there, you need to eradicate or defeat non-state actors, need to end civil wars and rebuild states, all of which is extremely challenging and difficult, and then help Iran and the countries of the region, first of all, push back on Iran and its interventionism, and like with the nuclear deal, offer a way forward for Iran to accept the norms of international law and international behavior and become a normal partner in the region. That will be a more stable region that then the U.S. can step back from. So it is very challenging and very complicated. The article obviously has more details in it, but I hope we've given a bit of a flavor of some of the ideas.
Yeah, sure. I mean, I think just to push that point a little bit further, you talk about how President Obama appears to have sort of implemented this offshore balancing act with regards to the Middle East, and the instability we see might be at least partially a reflection of the fact that the US has been perceived as isolating itself from some of the instability in the region. So are you suggesting, I mean, you seem to be suggesting that therefore the next administration needs to be more involved. There's obviously a great debate in Washington, D.C. as to regards what that means. Does that mean the US reassumes a much more assertive posture in the Middle East? Does it start using more military force? Does it start to really enforce conditions on the behavior and actions of other states? Or does it take another form?
Well, I think the key point is to have a vision of where you want to get to. To have a strategy, and then within that you can see which tools do we want to use. I think the nuclear deal is a good example, that President Obama knew that the end state that he wanted is a suspension of the weapons program that relates to the nuclear program in Iran. Now, in order to get there, he first tried diplomacy alone, then sanctions, and then again diplomacy. And through a combination of use of power, pressure, and clever or creative diplomacy, he got the result, or we got the result, a positive result. Sure. What's missing in the regional order is an endpoint that we want to get to. And that endpoint involves all the major players of the region accepting the norms of international relations and international law. And how to get there is the challenge. Now, that will require, yes, I think, more robust pushback from the U.S., maybe partly through its allies, occasionally through its own actions. This might be most visible in Syria, but it might also involve other arenas. In order to get stability, you have to convince Iran and Russia that that they have to stop trying to expand their power, and that they have to then go to diplomacy and the negotiating table. And for Iran in particular, the U.S., since 1979, has been part of a policy of encouraging its allies to fight with Iran, or Iraq, the Iran-Iraq war, dual containment, and all of that. And then suddenly the U.S. signed a nuclear deal and basically said, good luck. And leaving Iran and the American allies in a conflict system that the U.S. was part of creating. So I think the U.S., with help from other international players, needs to work towards a system in which the main countries all feel safe, but also the main countries also commit not to intervening, not to supporting militias or armed non-state actors in any other country of the region.
I think you hit on a very interesting point, which is this sort of almost hegemonic rivalry between Saudi Arabia and Iran. And I think there's a great debate within international relations experts as regards what actually is driving that rivalry. And sectarianism is the kind of default explanation that many people fall back on. But there are others who suggest that perhaps it's got much more to do with simply great power politics. We have two great states, and perhaps you could also now add in Turkey in that respect, who see themselves as potentially hegemonic actors in the region. And perhaps religion and sectarianism doesn't have as much of a part to play, but it's just a mobilizing force. We've heard President Obama before describe how the region is plagued by millennia's old conflicts, which of course is probably pointing towards that sectarian argument. Do you think there's something to that, or is it just fundamentally more about politics?
I think it is fundamentally about politics, but that doesn't make it all that simpler. On the Iranian side, there are two elements at play. One is the original revolutionary ideology and sentiment of the Islamic revolution in Iran. And in that sense, it's sort of like the old Soviet Union or others, where it was a revolution which claimed sort of the obligation to intervene in other societies and other countries. It's in their constitution. It's part of their, in a sense, official foreign policy through the Revolutionary Guards and so on. That still continues in the hardliners of Iran. Now, part of that policy is a genuine ideological belief that they're in charge of Shiites all over the world and oppressed wherever they perceive it. But there is also a power struggle going on within Iran as to who ends up in charge, the Revolutionary Guards or the more moderate pragmatists. In that sense, like the regime in Cuba or North Korea, this external belligerence often has a domestic political concern. But at the same time, Iran, in a more normal way, has a national security or regime security concern as well. This is a very paranoid regime, and like many paranoids, there's often some reason for that paranoia. The Iran-Iraq war is fresh in their mind. The US and Russia supported Iraq, as did most of the Arab states. They're afraid of what they see from the Sunni world and the rhetoric and so on. So they have a lot of what they perceive as national security concerns. On the Saudi side, as the main other player, putting Turkey and others aside, it is also a bit mixed, but I would say more simple in the sense that, yes, Saudi Arabia has a certain sort of Islamist and Wahhabist nature in its own society and regime, and it has funded and supported that, their own interpretation of religion in general. But I would say they've behaved more as, a state worried about their national security, and then using that very, not as a revolutionary state, unlike Iran, but as a tool to defend themselves. They did this with the Americans in Afghanistan. They've done this in other places where they've seen a threat to their own security. And I think the resolution of this rivalry or this conflict has to lean on the national security interest, that every state in the international system has a right to be concerned about its national security. It does not have a right to have a revolutionary or to claim revolutionary rights in other countries. So on national security, I think Riyadh and Tehran and Ankara and others can be brought to a table and say, okay, Tehran, what are your national security concerns behind your borders? Saudi Arabia, what are your concerns behind your borders, and where can we find common ground?
Yeah, interesting. Okay, well, final question. We've talked about how the next president should or should not be dealing with issues like terrorism. One thing we haven't spoken about yet is Russia's sort of increasing role in the region, and certainly political attempts to establish stronger relationships with certain governments that appear to be distancing themselves from the United States. So with that in mind, and with the complex picture you've painted about Saudi Arabia and Iran, and also Turkey inching in there as well, how should the next US president deal with this increasingly complex and assertive or aggressive geopolitics in the region, both from regional states themselves, but also from others coming inside?
Well, certainly the resurgence of Russia or Russian-American rivalry makes a bad situation worse. I mean, we have enough problems in the Middle East, let alone the Russians and Americans or others, like in the Cold War, trying to seek advantage. There's no doubt that Russia has tried to seek advantage in Syria, but it's interesting that it only did so after it was sure that this administration and President Obama would not react and would not push back. So I think the Russians are quite sensitive to pushback and to displays of power and so on. And hence, that's why I think there is an opening for US policy in Syria in particular, where really Russia has its only major investment. While accepting that Russia has a very important stake and position with the Syrian state, not necessarily with Mr. Assad, that at the same time the bloodshed has to end and a cessation of hostilities at a minimum has to be respected. And I think Russia would be responsive to that. Russia wants to have influence in the Middle East, but it also doesn't want to break relations with the US. It has a lot of common interests. But it is a complicating factor. On the other global arena, when you look at the real rising power in the long term, is China, not Russia.
Sure.
And there I think the US and China, at least as relates to the Middle East, are not so much in conflict. China has more economic and business interests, is investing in infrastructure, and could in some areas be a partner, at least in the economic and reconstruction challenges that will face Iraq and Syria, and the building of infrastructure throughout the region, which is important to create, to promote intra-regional trade and exchange and so on. So I think the US can work with China a bit more productively. Russia certainly will be a much more problematic player, but I think Russia accepts a limited role in the Middle East as long as it's sort of respected.
Interesting. Well, let's hope that's the next US president can resolve the various issues that we find. So just to recap, I'm Charles Lister here from the Middle East Institute. You've been listening to my colleague Paul Salem, Vice President for Policy and Research. I hope you can tune back to the next up-and-coming webcasts, and in the meantime, enjoy this one.